So after the resounding success that was my BC Ferries video from last year, and the rather mixed response from viewers, I've decided to talk about another terrible ferry company. Washington State Ferries is everything that is wrong with the ferry world today, and that is for a whole litany of reasons. Quite like BC Ferries, a lot of their vessels are old, slow, and rabbish, so let's take a look at some. First up, we have the Jumbo class ferries, with a top speed of a whopping 21 miles an hour, which may not sound so bad, but believe it or not, these are the fastest ferries in the fleet. Up next is the Issaquah class ferries, with a top speed of a grand total of 18 miles an hour, which may not sound like a small decrease, but considering how slow these things move, that's a lot of time being wasted. And that's not even the worst one. This ferry is called the Tillicum. 15 miles an hour? Come on! Also, hang on a minute. This ferry was built in 1959? Why is this thing still in revenue service? It should have been retired decades ago. This thing is even older than the Queen of New Windsor I roasted last time. I seriously don't understand why these ferry companies are so hell-bent on continuing to use these old, outdated ferries for such a long time, instead of retiring them after 30 or 40 years and replacing them with a newer and better ferry. Oh, but Frony, you might say. The reason that they keep these old ferries around for so long is because they're historic and they're more economically viable. Okay, first off, if these ferries are so important that they have to be kept in operational condition, then why not just put them into, oh, I don't know, preservation? Because that way, you can still keep these old ferries in operational condition while also not slowing down someone who might have an appointment that they need to get to at a certain time. The common business person does not care about how historic a vehicle may be. The only reason that they use public transit is to get from one place to another, and they would appreciate it if they could get there as quickly and efficiently as possible. Speaking of efficiency, you're telling me that it's more economical to keep these old ferries running for well over half a century than it is to retire them after a more reasonable time and replace them with newer ferries? That just sounds like you're either too cheap to buy new ferries, or you're too scared to see these ferries beat the scrapper's torch. Look, I know that these old ferries might be really important, but you can't keep them in service for too long when there are newer, better things available. Especially considering how slow these things are. We have airplanes that can go over 500 miles an hour. We have trains that can go over 200 miles an hour. So why do most ferry boats still travel at the speed of a snail? I'm sure that you could develop a ferry like the ones that Washington State uses that could go reasonably fast if you put in the research and development. Or better yet, just build a bridge! It just so happens that all of their routes are basically road connections. You just drive up on the ferry, cross the water, and then continue on the road when you get there. They actually did this with some of the former routes way back in the 1950s, and with how far bridge technology has come since then, how hard would it be to do the same with all the routes that exist now? Alright, money is a thing. Alright? Well, if this is the next best solution, can you at least keep your ferries up to a decent standard and retire them at a respectable age? And by the way, this isn't even a recent problem. Here's the 1938 Olympic, which was in service for 55 years! Also looks strangely similar to the Maine Queen. And then we come to the Ramadan, which was in service for 65 years! Why? And the strange part is that there were actually a decent number of ferries that were retired at a reasonable time. I'm not sure how many of these ferries were actually retired for good or just sold off to other companies, but one ferry I want to point out is the Kala Kala, which was in service for 41 years after it was rebuilt. This one has a rather strange looking design and doesn't look like most ferries. They went with a streamlined Art Deco styling, which makes sense for the era it was rebuilt. To be honest, it looks a little weird, and I think the design could have been a bit better, but I appreciate them for trying to make something that looks modern. And I'm most glad that I didn't overstay its welcome, considering it vibrated a lot in service. But there is one particular class of ferries that absolutely disgusts me. Let me introduce you to the Steel Electric class. They look fine on the surface, and the design is okay. They had a top speed of 14 miles an hour, which is pretty slow even by ferry standards. But that's not even the worst part about them. Take a guess of how long these things were in revenue service. 40 years? 50 years? 60 years? Well, you'd be wrong. These ferries were in service for 80 years! I'm not kidding! These ferries were built in 1927 and retired in 2007! Why? You know how the Queen of New Westminster is so old that a person can go from being an infant to an old grandpa in the time that's been in service? Well, the steel electric class ferries were in service for such a long time that a person could go from being an infant to being dead. These things were in service for longer than most people live. And you'll never guess what led to their long overdue retirement. In 2007, when they were doing an inspection, it was discovered that there was corrosion in the holes, and only then they were pulled from service because it would have been too dangerous to operate them. And hilariously, this happened right around the Thanksgiving rush. This is Exhibit A of why you don't keep machines in revenue service for longer than they should be. No machine will last forever. There will come a point in time where it becomes so rotten to the core that it simply cannot be used, in which case it needs to be retired and replaced by something newer. And this is still an issue to this day, by the way. There have been so many trip cancellations because these old ferries constantly need maintenance, and it's going to take them another few years before they finally get a fleet of brand new ferries. You know, maybe you wouldn't run into all these issues if you would just retire and replace these piles of rubbish sooner!